you. That should be well out now. Yep, there you go.
I can hear you better if I have my video off. My internet's not that bloody sharp out here. Sorry, you won't be able to look at my face, guys.
You look better with the video off, actually, Jeffy.
It's live now.
That's a typical response from you, Garrett.
Stefan, do you want to introduce Dougal to begin?
Yes, thank you. Kia ora koutou, good morning. Good morning. Kia ora koutou, good afternoon, good evening. What day is it? It's very nice to see you all. I'd like to introduce Dougal List, who is from Scott Consulting, isn't it, Dougal? But he is the Program Director for Water Reform, working with all Wellington Water Councils. And we're very pleased to have him here this evening to facilitate and guide us through this conversation. So thank you, Dougal, very much.
Hey, thanks very much, Stefan, and kia ora koutou. Nice to be joining you online. Apologies, I'm not there in person on this lovely evening. So what we were going to do today is I've got a set of slides to run you through in terms of the Water Services Entity Bill, and the outcome is really just to help have a conversation about where and how you might want to put a submission in on the bill. I've helped a couple of other conversations with some of the other Wellington Water Councils and Kapiti Coast over the last couple of weeks on this, so I could share a few insights from what they're thinking or doing around the bill. And I'm really happy for this to be a really open conversation as we go along. So if you have any questions, just throw them in as we go. It's probably just fine. So I'm just going to try and share my screen. I'm blocked from sharing my screen. Is anyone able to change that so I can pull up my slides, or?
Yeah, try again now.
Right, there we go. Excellent. So just pulling those up now. Okay, so what I'll do is just walk you through the Water Services Entities Bill in terms of a bit of an oversight of what's in the bill and the content, and then some key insights and considerations which might guide some of your thinking around where and how you might want to submit on the bill. So just in terms of an overview to start off with, sorry, the bill is the first of several pieces of legislation linked to the water reforms, and it really focuses on the establishment of the new water services entity. So most of the content is around the ownership, the governance and the accountability of these new water services entities, and some of the transition arrangements, which are particularly set out in Schedules 1 to 4. So there will be a lot of further legislation, particularly the second bill that we're expecting late in the year will have a hang of a lot of detail around the transition provisions and pricing of the water services entities and all its other powers. So there will be a lot of interest, particularly in that second bill, because that's where all the real detail will lie. So the first bill is really a setup bill. It's establishing legislation, and then the second bill will have a lot more detail. And there'll also be a bit of legislation coming out of MB, which will establish the economic regulator. And we don't have quite such a clear time frame for that, but a really important part of water reforms too. And with particularly the second bill, there will be quite a few consequential amendments to other bits of legislation, like the Local Government Act, to give effect to the water services entities. So the time frames on this, the bill was introduced in the 2nd of June and had its first reading on the 9th of June. Relatively short submission period to the Select Committee. Those close next Friday on the 22nd of July. So we're expecting then that select committee process will be sometime around August. I hear that there'll be a bit of a rolling roadshow around the country for that, so that people have got the chance to present locally. And the select committee has to report back by November, which means we're expecting enactment by late 2022. And as you see with that timeline there, that starts to kind of raise some questions about how much of the second bill will we actually see before we actually get into the select committee hearing process. And we certainly don't have a lot of visibility of it at this point. So some of the things that you probably want to raise may be in relation to the second bill, but you might want to raise them in terms of your submission on the first bill as well, particularly around those transition arrangements. So, as I said, the structure of the bill, it really focuses on the establishment of the water services entities. So there's a lot of detail in there, and it sets out the water services entities largely as we've come to expect through the exposure draft of the legislation and the version that the governance working group got to consider. So they're body corporate organisations. Some of the changes that were recommended by the governance working group have been incorporated. It's well aligned with the recommendations, and I'll take you through that in a second as well. So particularly around ownership, so they've incorporated the recommendation that the water services entities are owned through a shareholding model by territorial authorities. So 1 share per 50,000 population or part thereof. So South Wairarapa gets a share, same as Upper Hutt. Hutt City with 120,000 people would have 3 shares. So basically every council gets some degree of share. Now, the shares don't actually confer a lot of rights. It's an ownership model in name. However, that may play out through the Constitution that more shares means you have more voting rights around membership of the regional representative groups. It doesn't confer any additional voting rights on decisions of the bodies, though. The bill also sets out some pretty strong protections from privatisation. So that was another one of the key areas of feedback that people had, very strong concern around would the water services entities end up being privatised in the future, as well as the role of the Crown. So the Crown's got a role in terms of setting the government policy statement and to monitor and provide oversight as well as intervention where necessary of the water services entity. So a little bit like the Crown has got an oversight and intervention role for local government, similar provisions for water services entities. It establishes the 2-tier governance model, so a governance layer of the regional representative group, which is very much on that co-governance basis, equal number of mana whenua and council reps, and the bill has 12 to 14 reps on that group, and then the ability to establish regional advisory panels. So both of those are a co-governance layer, and they sit across the board of the water services entity, which is a competency-based board appointed by a subcommittee of the regional representative group. The bill also has some provisions around review, so a review after a 5 and 10 year period, which I think is really a sensible approach, and also starts to put in place some of the things which help with transition, like a defer of water-related bylaws during the establishment period. So just on that governance model, hopefully this diagram you can see on your screen helps to show how that works. So the regional representative group provides that governance oversight layer, equal number of representatives of mana whenua and local councils. Now, with 12 to 14 representatives from a massive area which stretches from Tairāwhiti, Gisborne to the top of the South Islands, 22 councils, a significantly larger number of iwi, hapu and marae within that area. The Constitution will set out how membership of that group is established. So we don't have any detail on that yet, but as you know, that number of bodies into 12 to 14 means that there will be quite a lot of discussion to work through representative arrangements. And that's really where that regional advisory panel comes in. So you might recall in previous discussions, we talked about the importance of it's really hard to make investment trade-off discussions between the needs of Martinborough with Nelson and Gisborne. So how do you have a more sensible regionally based investment trade-off discussion? That's where those regional advisory panels we hope will play their part and also allow for all councils and all, or iwi groups to have representation as part of the water services entities. So that regional representative group appoints the board members and also has quite a lot of responsibility around monitoring and oversight of the water services entities, which I'll come on to. They then sit across the top of the water services entity board, who are responsible for management oversight of the water services entity, and then you'd have the water services entity and the CEO, etc. structure. So all that's set out in the legislation and has a lot of detail on the roles and responsibilities of each of the layers. Just on those in particular, the regional representative group has got quite a lot of responsibility in terms of setting the statement of strategic intent and approving the strategic elements of the statement of intent. Has to be consulted on things like the funding and pricing plan and the asset management plan, and has the board appointment committee. Co-governance arrangement between territorial authority owners and iwi hapu representatives. And you know, their territorial authority representatives must be an elected member, chief executive or senior manager with relevant experience. And so they have the powers to establish those regional advisory groups, regional advisory panels as well. The board then of the water services entity is the competency-based board. It's not a co-governance model, it's a competency-based appointment model. And they've got to demonstrate a range of expertise across the board to make sure that they have got the right skills to oversee the water services entities. Just moving on to Schedule 1, I've kind of skipped through the content of the bill because it's not a particularly lengthy bill, and it dwells in a lot of detail on those different groups and how they're established and the roles and responsibilities. That's where all the detail lays. A lot of the interesting stuff to me, and maybe where you want to focus some of your submission, really sits in Schedule 1 through to 4, particularly Schedule 1. So when the bill's enacted, it sets up what's called the establishment period. And that's basically from the date of enactment, which would say is going to be late this year, through to 1 July 2024. And during that time, there are certain powers that DIA effectively has to set up the water services entity and have oversight of councils as well. One of the things that we're interested in is we know DIA is really struggling with the amount of work that's required to get the water services entities up and running. And so they're taking a kind of what's the minimum viable product to get to day one approach. So how does this transition establishment period align with the day one approach? And why that's of concern for councils is the less you set up for minimum viable product or day one, the more might be the accountability or ongoing responsibility of councils post 1 July 2024. So, for example, not all assets might be transferred across to the water services entities. Maybe billing's not in place by the water services entities. So maybe, and we just don't have this detail yet, councils might be responsible for having to manage ongoing billing for a period of time, or look after some assets for a period of time, or have some other liabilities. So during that period, the Minister appoints the interim boards of each of the water services entity. And you know, there's a board already of the National Transition Unit headed by Brian Roche, and DIA appoint interim CEOs. So there is a process underway to start looking at the CEs. We're really interested in that happening as soon as possible. The latest I heard is they possibly won't be in place until early next year. And the longer that is delayed, the less time we've got for the water services entities to be up and running. The Schedule 1 also sets out really some of the critical deliverables which have to be developed over this establishment period. So the first is the allocation schedule. And this is the schedule which sets out, here's all the things which will transfer from councils or Wellington Water to the new water services entity. So it covers assets, vehicles, plant, land, etc., liabilities, and anything else, data systems, all that kind of thing. So the principles around that allocation schedule we're expecting to see in the next month or two, and then that'll be developed over the next 12 months. So we'll have a lot of interest in that. And that'll be linked to the establishment plan. And this is really the critical output which DIA are responsible for. It's the roadmap. So it's the plan and the process for how and when will staff or functions or assets and liabilities be transferred from you to the new water services entity. And this is really the critical bit that we just don't have any visibility on. We know DIA is working hard on this, and we understand we'll see some version of this in the next month. But this really is the critical bit for being able to explain to people how does this transition actually going to happen in practice. A couple of other really important deliverables, the asset management plan. So the new water services entity needs a whole of entity asset management plan. So how does that pick up existing asset management plans? Does it do it on a constrained or unconstrained basis? What do councils need to do to feed into that? What levels of service does that going to aim to achieve? To what degree is that standardized across the whole of the entity? A lot of detail to work through. Again, we just don't have a lot of clarity of that process yet. And that'll feed into the funding and pricing plan. So really of interest to our communities and consumers, how much am I going to be charged? Who's going to charge me? When are they going to charge me? What's resulting in change to my my rates? So another really important part of it, and that is obviously linked back to the asset management plan and the work that's required. A little bit like you'll recall in the Better Off funding agreement, there was the conditions in there which said you must cooperate with the reforms process. That's repeated in the bill. So basically, when it's enacted, local government must cooperate with reasonable requests for the secondment of staff and for information during the establishment period. It also sets out the terms for transfer of staff, really of importance to Wellington Water and councils that have water staff. And basically, if you've got a job which is in water, you must be offered a same or similar position on similar terms to what you currently have. If you don't accept, there's no entitlement to redundancy, and that's relatively standard in terms of what we'd expect. But the communications to staff is a really, really important part of the transition process. Government has some oversight powers during the establishment period, and these were taken from the Auckland transition. And basically, they'll have the power to oversee any kind of key decisions that you make over the next 2 years in relation to water. We assume this is to stop local government making decisions which might be perceived as not in the interests of the water services entities. And also the costs of establishment of the water services entity by the Crown over the next 2 years can be reimbursed from the water services entity. So there's quite a lot in the Schedule 1. If you get a chance to look at the bill, I'd recommend looking at Schedule 1, quite interesting. Schedules 2, 3 and 4. Schedule 2 sets out the boundary of what was formerly called Water Services Entity C. We're now termed Eastern Central. The boundary is basically unchanged from what you would have seen previously. So from Tairāwhiti, Gisborne, all the way down to the top of the south, Titaihu, and aligns with that Ngāi Tahu Takiwā boundary. So it chops off part of Tasman and Marlborough down that way. Schedule 3 is quite important as well, in that it sets out the key documents that each entity has to prepare. So that statement of intent, asset management plan, funding and pricing plan, infrastructure strategy, and it sets out who gets to have input into those. What's the consultation requirements on the water services entity and that. So territorial authorities are called out as being really important to be consulted in the development of that. And one of the challenges going forward in the future will be these will be big, challenging, complicated processes. How do we ensure that councils have got sufficient capability to influence those documents? How do you kind of have enough skin in the game to make sure that they care about the upgrade to the wastewater plant in Martinborough, as opposed to prioritising that in relation to something in Nelson or Hastings? And Schedule 4 sets out the divestment process. So that's the process of if a water services entity wants to get rid of any particular assets, and quite a high bar set there as well. Just a few other insights for you. So firstly, timing and content of the bill, as mentioned at the start. This is, the tip of the iceberg really in terms of the legislation. So it's the High Level Establishment Act. second bill's really where the interest is going to be. We won't have a lot of detail on that before submissions are due, or potentially before the select committee hearings. It's still really complicated to explain the reforms to the public. We had hoped that the bill would come out with some better public information, which helped to explain why the reforms were happening, what do they look like, etc. And that we're still waiting on that from DIA. The bill's pretty prescriptive. So some of the details around the establishment of the regional representative groups, maybe that would be better contained in a constitution rather than in legislation. It makes this consistency across all 4 water services entities and less arguments down the track, perhaps, but it's that balance there. As I mentioned, we're really interested in day 1 and transition to the water services entity and how it aligns with the bill. The constitution. So in the bill, the minister will issue the constitution after engagement with territorial authority owners in mana whenua, but there's no detail really on the process of that or the timing. So how do you get a chance to have a say as one of the future owners of the water services entity on your own constitution? A lot of detail around governance and accountabilities for commercial and financial aspects. Are those clear and workable? Some things that councils are thinking about, including alignment with other provisions in the Local Government Act. Are the staff transfer provisions fair and reasonable? One of the key matters that we've called out there on behalf of Wellington Water is senior staff aren't clearly defined but aren't guaranteed a role. Depending on how you cut it at Wellington Water, we've got between 1 and 30 senior staff. So who does that apply to? And we're still just waiting on detail on the transition. So what's the roadmap? What's the engagement process? It's really difficult to get good, clear information across the reforms process. What are the change impacts on councils, which will be influenced by that roadmap? And lastly, for me, just a run through of the governance working group report. So pretty good alignment with the governance working group report. I was asked which of the recommendations isn't aligned with. There were quite a few recommendations in the governance working group report, which were either a little bit vague or kind of things which were to be kicked down the line a little bit, such as we think the governance working group should be consulted in the development of the constitution. So not everything's been picked up, but in terms of the key provisions, my view is it's pretty well aligned with what the governance working group. So big things that they recommended was setting out an ownership model, which has been picked up with that 1 share per 50,000 population, strengthening the accountability requirements around the statement of intent and performance expectation and sub-regional advisory groups. Very well aligned with co-governance recommendations and Te Mana o Te Wai recommendations of the working group, and has strengthened the provisions around te tiriti as well. So I think those that is a bit of a whistle stop through the bill, but very happy to take any questions on any of that. Alistair.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. That was very good, clear, concise thing. I've got 2 questions. I've written a whole lot of things that I want to bring up later, but 2 questions really. Can you just confirm that there's nothing in this bill that infers or confers any form of ownership or rights to take or use water?
Not that I can recall. What you did make me think of, though, is there are a couple of provisions, and I need to double check which ones, which make it very clear that the bill has no impact on treaty settlements, but it doesn't really deal with the taking or use of water. It's mainly focused on the establishment of the water services entities.
Okay, so it's more aligned to assets rather than raw material.
Yes.
Yep. Good. That's confirmed what I thought. And the second one is the billing process, is that going to be the same, have the same protections as rates currently do, i.e. A tax by definition and therefore the right to enforce collection? Or is this going to be more of a service where if you don't pay, it can be cut off?
Yeah, really good question. We're not sure about that yet. We did put in, so there's quite a few work streams which kind of coalesce around this issue. So we put a submission in on the policy work that MB did last year. And that's one of the areas we focused our submission on, around ability to pay, and water being, an essential, not service, but an essential provision for people's well-being. So what did you do about
access to water is a human right? So under the human
yeah,
rights.
that's right. So what do you do when someone can't afford it? How do you deal with issues of affordability? So yeah, but pricing and billing's an area where we know there's quite a lot of work going on, but we don't have very good visibility of it at the moment. So will the water services entities have the right to enforce costs like a rate? I'm not sure. Or will they bill like a service? I'm not quite sure there either. There's some interesting issues around it being a 3 water model, not 2. So if you're a connected customer to a drinking water supply and a sewerage supply, that's pretty clear. But there'll also be customers who receive benefits from stormwater management who might not perceive that they're getting value, but how the water services entity manages the stormwater system means that they don't get flooded down the line.
I suppose just I wasn't quite sure who said it about the human right, but I don't recall anything in the Human Rights Act that says that water is a human right. The Human Rights Act is quite specific, and so we all say, oh, that's a human right, that's a human right. Well, actually, under law, none of these things are human rights. The human rights are specifically spelled out in the Human Rights Act, and there's nothing in this that actually says you are entitled to get water, is there?
Not in this bill, at least. No. I think it's that kind of issue that we just don't have visibility on, which will be covered off in the second bill, or will be covered off in economic regulation. It's a different model of cost tension and service provision in the future as well. So while councils have this role of governance and oversight, there'll also be consumer forums, and there'll also be an economic regulator. So the economic regulator will have a challenging role to make sure that the water services entities are spending money on the right thing at the right price and charging the right kind of way to consumers. And they'll also have to do that through the lens of, are you dealing with environmental issues and good consumer service and good asset management? So there's a number of different things that they'll have to balance there. And we brought in some economic regulation experts from the electricity energy sector to help us with our submission, and their view was that economic regulation around water is going to be quite a lot more complicated than it is for electricity.
Thank you.
So in terms of what some other councils are thinking of, Wellington City put up their draft submission to council last week, and there was quite a bit of debate around that. It was a relatively high level submission. Most of the other councils in our region seem to be looking at generally a higher level of submission, which basically starts off with, do they broadly support or not the direction of the reforms, and then moving into what are the key concerns that they have. So part of what they've drawn on there has been some of the content of their 8-week letters from last year as a kind of a starting point. Quite a lot of focus around concerns about the detail about transition, and then usually focusing on some other kind of specific issue which is relevant to the council. So for example, Greater Wellington wanting to have more clarity around what happens to stormwater and floodwater interface, and also what happens to land which is currently held for water, drinking water collection. So slightly different issues for each council. So I think, some of the issues that I've heard from you before are that rural interface issue and how rural water supply is treated. But Councillor, I'm not sure to call you Jeppy or not, sir.
Everyone else does, among other things too. Hey, look, just going by the stunned silence that's around at the moment, you hit the nail on the head. My biggest problem here, there's a complete lack of detail, and it's very hard to make any comment or reaction without that detail. I mean, Alistair touched on it before. I mean, what do we do? I mean, there's nothing really new there. Just about everything you put in front of us is what I've read before, but you detailed it pretty well. But you know, hell, if once we get the content, we can actually make some submission around something. Well, I don't know what the other people's views are.
Yep, look, I think that's a really good point, and it's one of the things that we are struggling with and are raising with DIA through a number of channels. You know, and I think one thing to think about is the submission process is a channel, but there are other channels as well, you know, via DIA as well. But Councillor Plummer, you're on mute, sir.
Colin, you've got your hand up, so away you go.
Thanks, Alistair. You're a real gentleman. Thank you very much. I guess I'm probably reinforcing a little bit what Jeff is saying, because what we're getting back from our community is what's this likely to cost per unit. You know? I mean, we're not getting that information. There are a number of unknowns, to be quite honest, and you've pointed some about tonight. Certainly in terms of the makeup of the entities and the professional skills that people will bring to the boards to assist us in making those decisions. So that's not clear on what that lineup of skills is. But cost is a big factor. You know, if we're seeing a general increase in rates across the board, and councils, of course, won't have the three waters to worry about in their rating mechanism, but they'll still have a number of other things that need to be rated. And of course, if three waters come in at a substantial price, that's going to have a huge impact on our communities. Yeah. So I guess that's my biggest concern, my biggest fear.
Yeah, look, I think it's a very good question, and it's also a question of when will that information be available. You know, there is a bit of a risk that it'll be really quite late in the transition process that you'll be able to give good, clear information to your community about what they'll be paying in the future and what they'll get as a result of that. Because before that can happen, you need to have an asset management plan. You need to have a funding and pricing plan. The entity needs to understand its borrowing capacity and what that means in terms of how quickly it can raise capital and spend money. So there's a whole bunch of unknowns, which really cut to the heart of what the community want to know of. What's it going to cost me and what do I get as a result?
Thank you, Drew.
Alistair?
Yeah, I don't know if it would help everybody. You guys all know where I stand on this, and I've made it very public and written a public letter that I oppose this whole process. And at the basis of our opposition to this, which Lee and Rebecca signed the letter with me, was specifically against this particular bill. And I think that first and foremost, I'd like to know where you all stand and whether, as elected officials, we are going to put in a letter supporting this or opposing it, because that will then lead us down a particular path. I personally have put in a submission to oppose this and request to speak to the select committee. But and you've already heard me say that as a council, I think we need to take a stand and say, what do we actually think? Now, we have to decide that tonight before we go any further. Otherwise, what are we doing here? So,
just Alistair, just a cautionary process perspective. There's no decisions made in this meeting. It's a workshop. So any decisions, if you would like to vote on that, we'd have to hold it on the 14th.
Oh, absolutely. But on the 14th, we're going to be deciding in public on what we're going to workshop here, because you as staff are going to have to go out and write a submission to present back to us in a public arena. But there's no point in us giving you a guidance if we're all going to sit there and go, oh no, we don't oppose it, or we don't. That's the starting point to this, is to say, where do we think as councillors we should be attacking this from? Because if you haven't got the starting point, where are you going to go from?
Just if I can add a comment on that, it's been an issue which has come up in other council discussions as well. There's been a range of views in the room in terms of the reforms. What some have found it useful to do as a starting point of whether or not they agree with the need for reform. How the reform occurs is a kind of different conversation. So that came through quite strongly at Wellington City, for example, when they debated their submission, was their mayoral task force had identified the need for some change in terms of the reform, but there was also a range of views around the room about whether or not this reform model was the appropriate reform model and best for Wellington City. So that might just be something you pick up in the submission as well. Garrick?
Yeah, a couple of points. Starting from the rural side of things, if the regulator is going to be looking after drinking water, even though that presumably goes through to all the rural suppliers as well, because the regulator, whether or not they're part of Three Waters, that regulator will still be there. So therefore, I'm assuming the regulator is going to be paid either by the rural water suppliers, or it'll be paid, subsidised by the urban payer. But I mean, I'm sitting here as a rural water user and wondering, do I have to end up paying the regulator for the quality of water that goes through, or can I go beyond that? That's one question. The other thing, and who's going to police that? Is that going to be policed by the regulator, or is it going to be policed by the regional council? Or is it going to be district council? And who's going to be actually out there checking up on these guys? And the figures we're getting is 70 to 100,000 properties out there which are going to have to be regulated. And taking on Alistair's point, and I go back to your earlier comment, Dirk, about the 8-week questions. We had some very good questions in there. Most of them were not satisfactorily answered, because they didn't know the answer. We were still sitting there saying, well, okay, what's going to happen to a water race? If it's a stock water, but does it have storm water in it? Therefore, it becomes part of Three Waters. And that means nothing to town, but out here, it does mean a lot. And we're going through this huge battle at the moment, working out what we're going to do with our water races. So I'm concerned about that. And also I'm concerned when you say we have to consult. No, well, Alice's point again, are we going to have time to consult with any of our community, or are we going to assume the questions we put up in our 8-week questions are actually have raised the concerns we've got with our public? Now, Alice, I don't know what the public think, to be honest. I mean, I know the people I've talked to, but it seems to me we haven't actually consulted, because we don't really know what we're consulting on, apart from those earlier questions. And from a rural point of view, I haven't got a clue. I mean, I don't know if I'm going to have to pay for my water, or I'm going to have to subsidise my other buildings on my property. So yeah, very confusing, sorry.
I'll try and respond to each question. So regulator is an interesting one. So we're moving to a 3 regulator model. So Taumata Arawai are responsible for regulating the quality of drinking water. And as you say, they've got a real journey ahead of them. There's, as you say, 70 to 100,000 rural drinking water schemes in the country. Huge number more than what anyone knew. The initial estimate was somewhere between 5 and 10,000, but there's a massively huge number. And they range from 2 or 3 houses which are on a shared scheme to 2 to 3,000 properties which are on a shared scheme. So I'm not deeply involved with Taumata Arawai, but from hearing Bill Bayfield speak on a number of occasions, I know they're trying to take a pragmatic and staged approach to that. So they're gradually working through and working with the bigger schemes first, the ones which are already registered schemes and have got a transition timeline and have got a graded schedule of kind of requirements for rural water. I can't answer the question around how they're paid. I'm not quite sure, sorry, but I could check that out for you and come back. The 8-week letter, as you say, you did have a bunch of good points which have been raised, and I agree. Yourselves, like other councils, haven't had satisfactory answers to a lot of that detail. We still don't have a lot of that detail, and they are the things that your community will care about. So, I think it's worth going back to that letter and saying, what's still relevant, what's still valid. Let's put that in our submission again if it's still useful. Because
do we have time to do that before the?
Well, you do in terms of looking at your 8-week letter. I think your other question about do you have time to actually consult with your community?
We don't have time for that. You're right. No way.
No.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think that this is the challenging thing was, councils were always kind of told the time for engagement will be through the select committee process. Communities can have their say on the process through the select committee process. The reality is that the select committee process is quite a high bar for the community to kind of engage with. So it's not really a consultation process at all.
Sorry, Dougal, I have to call you out on that. That's not entirely true. What we were told was that it was an opt-in or opt-out, and we would have the opportunity to directly consult with our community, not the select committee process. That got changed without any consultation.
That is a fair point as well. Absolutely. So that did get changed during the process too. So the goalposts have shifted through this process in terms of the timing expectations around community consultation. What some councils have done, like Upper Hutt and Lower Hutt, they have undertaken some engagement over the past 6 months, and they're using that as the basis of saying, we've talked to our community, we've asked them what they care about, here's the key issues that they are worried about, and they've using that as a basis of their submissions as well. Any other thoughts from others in terms of key issues?
Thanks for that, because I've got to say, I think we're up against a very tight timeline. And once again, going back to Alice's point, I think we just have to take the questions we've already raised and say, look, we've asked these questions, and until we get some answers, maybe we hold back and we don't have time to consult on this stuff. And as you say, there's 2 more acts coming down the line, are there not?
There are, that's right.
Okay, thank you.
I think another issue, which is, sorry, go ahead, Councillor Hay.
Oh, no. So, look, I'm on the same page as Alistair. I agree we need changes in how we manage our waters, but I think the current proposal is flawed in the extreme. But my question is, what do you think is the benefit of doing a submission on this first part of the Act? What do you think? Will our voice be heard? What are Carterton and Masterton doing? Or do you think we're just wasting our time here and rather better to focus on the second part? Sorry, I'm not meaning to put you on the spot, but we could spend a lot of time putting this all together as a tiny council, and it's just flipped under the rug, so to speak.
It's a very good question. It's something I've talked at length with Stefan about. Is it's really hard for smaller councils to have the resources to engage in this reform. You don't have a lot of staff. You don't have a lot of people sitting around doing nothing. So to have to pull together a submission or to get involved in a working group or provide information and data to DIA is another big job that you don't have people just waiting to do the work. I mean, luckily we're joined today by Robin, who's in the room, I think. Yep. And we've been waiting for ages for some clarity on funding support for councils through transition. So does doing a submission help you? Look, you'll have a slightly different set of views and issues even from Carterton or Masterton. We debated and asked the question of should we do a regional submission, and the view was councils wanted to do their own submissions, but we've kind of tried to connect up people from different councils in the region to share the thinking. So there are some resources out there so that you're not working from a blank slate. It shouldn't be too much work to pull together a submission, but I totally acknowledge it's still another job on top of all the other jobs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Dougal. It does, for a small council, it is extremely challenging to put together a submission in such a short space of time.
Alistair?
I would just make the point to you, Lee, though, that you know, if every small council takes the same view as us, then this goes through completely unopposed, and the way that will be seen is that we support it. Now, you know, Garrick, you could say that you haven't heard from the ratepayers. Well, I can tell you that I have heard very loud and clear, almost non-stop, almost every few days. I get an email or a comment or somebody makes a conversation or whatever against this reform. Not necessarily that the reform is not necessary, but against this particular reform and how it's been done. And I'm very clear that that we. Not only that, we are elected to lead as well. And sometimes actually you have to lead, and actually you have to take a stand, and you can over consult, but actually the public of our district voted us to be their councillors and be their voice people. And sometimes you have to actually act on that. And I believe this is one of those moments that we actually have to say, what do we as a council think is important for our community? And, you know, we don't need the public to tell us that. That's our decision as a council.
Can I just comment? I agree with what you're saying, Alice, but in terms of credibility, the only written beginning point we've got are those 8 questions. And I'm quite happy to go from there and say, we've asked this is what we want to get the answer to, and we are not getting the answers. And therefore, and the comment I'm hearing out there is that, yes, they do want a reform, but just not this one.
Well, interestingly on that most of those questions that we asked deal with the issues of ownership, governance, accountability, and boundaries. And that is the basis of this act. The other 2 acts are more the practical things that are going to come through. This is the starting point, which is the democratic issue of this act. And that's what we asked most of our questions on. So if we're not going to make a submission on this, what are we going to make a submission on?
Well, have we decided not to make a submission on this?
Well, no, we haven't.
What do our colleagues say? I think we should. Otherwise, once again,
well, I think we should too.
Whole left there. Sorry, Colin, you're going to say something. Or are you lost?
Yeah, sorry, I'm I guess I'm keen to hear a little bit from Alison, because he's made a couple of good points that I'm quite I'd be quite comfortable if he could answer for me. One is without drilling down on the detail. I mean, like you, I've spoken to people in our community, and there is no doubt about the fact that reform is needed within the 3 entity. But my people I'm speaking to are saying they don't clearly understand the model in terms of the governance structure, and I guess we've done our best to try and explain that to them. So without drilling down too much detail, what are the people telling you about the reforms, for instance, that we should be alerted to? I mean, because, you know, we're all hearing different stories. So I'm really keen. You've stated that you've heard from people in that community. They're opposed to it. What areas are they opposed to?
Okay, there's well, I can go through it quite easy. And those of you who, when we put our questions up, heard me very loud and clear then. The issue of the makeup of the governance structure with the iwi representation, that is very clearly.
So the co-governance thing, is that what you're talking about?
The co-governance issue is very high up there. The removal of assets from the entity.
What do you mean, the removal of assets from the entity? In other words, a transfer of assets to the
transfer of assets, yeah. And the accountability to the ratepayers. So how is this entity going to be accountable to Mrs. Miggins on the corner when her pipe bursts? You know, right now, all our ratepayers can bang on the table at us and hold us accountable. How do the ratepayers who are going to be paying the bills hold somebody to account? These are the big issues that people are really, really worried about. They're not worried about who digs the hole in the ground, because actually the same people are going to be digging the holes in the ground tomorrow as they are today.
Great. Yeah.
But they're worried about the accountability. They're worried about the representation. They're worried about the issue of billing.
Okay, that's great. Thanks for that.
Can we throw rural in there too? Because there's so many unanswered questions on the rural side.
Yeah, so those comments were more from the urban side, but the rural is the absolute unknown. Are they going to be forced to join this entity for a start?
And you're right, rural is an unknown quantity, to be quite honest. Yeah.
Lee?
Yeah, I'd just like to reiterate what Alistair's saying. I've had a lot of feedback. There's an extreme displeasure on one end of the spectrum, right to much more strenuous, certainly about the co-governance model. I agree with Alistair that they actually don't care who digs up the pipe, which entity, but they see it as assets that they've paid for over the last 100+ years, and they see it as being stolen assets. They're also concerned about privatisation. It's something that's come through quite strongly for me, or people have spoken to me. And even though there's some assurances given that there's bits in the legislation that won't allow that to happen, we all know a change of government can change legislation overnight. So, and again, they think they acknowledge our infrastructure needs improving, but they just do not like the way this has been ramroded through with no consultation. And so that's what I'm getting. It's sort of feedback I'm getting. So if there's some way we can do a submission that would echo those concerns from our ratepayers and us as councillors, that would be good.
Just to throw a few thoughts in there, that they are challenging issues to put submissions in on, and that you are rubbing up against some of the government's bottom lines around co-governance and separation of balance sheet. However, I completely acknowledge that these are valid concerns that the community has. In that, number one recommendation from the governance working group was that people don't really understand the reforms, and the government needs to do a much better job of explaining why reforms are necessary, how the model will work in practice. So, how you pitch some of these concerns might be something you want to consider. And I'm not sure, Stefan, if you've got any thoughts on this, but an option might be putting forward in your submission concerns that we're hearing from the communities. They don't understand these things. Co-governance is a new model which hasn't been seen in a lot of places in New Zealand. Some people, it's a challenging new concept. How will it work in practice? What does this mean for me? The ownership issue, again, how it's usually explained is it's transfer of ownership from one public entity to another public entity. It's not privatisation. It's not going to anyone else. It's just being held by another public entity. But it's how these things are explained. And I acknowledge that concern. Alistair?
Yeah, I agree with what you've just said. I think it is a bottom line for this government, but that doesn't mean we can't fight back against it. That it may well be a bottom line to a government, but it was not a bottom line that was put to the election. So there's no mandate. The fact they've got a majority in Parliament doesn't give you unfettered power to ram things through just because you want to. And we are hearing it very, very clearly back from the community that this is an issue that actually the community is concerned about. And so, we as their elected representatives have not only, we actually have a duty to actually put a submission on this and say these things are upsetting our community and are not right. Now, we might not be listened to, but we will have done our duty to the best of our ability, and not to do so, I think, is a failure on ourselves.
Chippy?
Yes, sorry about that. Hey, look, the people that I speak to that aren't happy with the Three Waters are the same people that don't trust this government. And that's flowing on into the Three Waters. They think they're up to something. And I can't answer a lot of questions that are chucked at me because, as I said before, there's no detail we've got at the moment. I don't know what the hell to do. I mean, I oppose it in its form now. It needs it. I think they need to be a lot more transparent in what they're trying to do.
Stefan, did you want to speak to how you're thinking about pulling together the submission? Because it sounds like it's coming back to council next week.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, Amanda has been tasked with the difficult job of drafting that submission. Really, this is a purely political conversation and a purely political decision being led by councillors and management have no voice in this at all. And so what we're really doing is supporting councillors to express themselves properly. That's really our role here, and that will be that's the function of the submission. My mum always said to me, though, when you've got a problem, express the problem, but also try and express the solution as well. So my advice would be to say what's wrong with the bill, but also say, if you can, what you would rather see. You know, where an improvement can be made, and it's not just the wholesale rejection of a proposition. Where an improvement can be made, I would highlight, that improvement. But Amanda, you might have something more profound to say than that. Thanks.
No, I think that's a very good perspective, Stefan. I think it's really helpful if you think about who's reading the submission. I think, Lee, you spoke quite eloquently on, is this worth doing? How much effort do we put in? And it's me, the writer, that would be probably taking the next day and a half to try and put something together. And both Stefan and Dougal have sent me a whole lot of information, and I have got a little bit of support from Robin as well. But very much think about, if you were the select committee, what would you want to be hearing, and how would you like it framed? I think it's always helpful to think about who's reading what you're writing as well. But I've taken a ton of notes, and I've noted that there's already some 8 questions that I haven't seen before that I'll go back to as well, and that might help frame up the working draft.
Amanda, I would be very happy to help you with that draft. There's no.
Can I just make a comment here, because I can see we've obviously got a different view on things. There's no doubt about it, and we're not going to get consensus. I can tell you now, any submission that goes through, to be quite honest, and just getting some of the feedback now, because I disagree with some of the things that Alistair's talking about. So and I like the idea of Stephen suggesting we find a solution to the problem, but I still don't believe at the end of the day that we'll get consensus for any submission to go through. So I'm not sure how we're going to manage that moving forward.
So one way of doing that is to pitch things as questions, or say that the community is divided, or that the council is divided on these issues, and then that some of the lack of clarity is the issue of that division. I don't know, that could be one way of pitching it.
It's certainly how Hutt City are looking to pitch theirs, and again, so that they did have that luxury of going through an engagement process earlier in the year. So they're very much saying, based on what our community have told us, things that we are concerned about, which we don't have enough detail on at this point, are. And that's possibly similar to what you're raising around some of the issues that you've raised tonight. Of, we're hearing some of these concerns from our community. We're not quite sure how to answer them. We're therefore raising them as concerns. And as Stefan says, where you can, providing some solutions, I think is a very positive way of reframing that. But Lee?
So just a very good point made, Stefan. I agree with you. So one of the most significant things that people give me feedback is a co-governance role. And I think that's an overlay from the Labour government and a lot of their other policies. But just thinking about a possible solution, what I'm hearing back from our ratepayers is New Zealand is 15% Maori, 17% and I think 15% Asian. Let the governance model reflect the diversity in New Zealand, not reflect just one single group, which is not 50% of the population. And I know this is a challenging conversation, but this is what our ratepayers are telling me, people in our community. So that is a possible another way to look at that co-governance role as a possible option. I mean, I like the idea of what you said, Amanda, that we're not all going to agree, but a lot of us don't agree simply because of the challenges that we just don't have the information, and that's made it very hard to have a consistent, cohesive response from all of us. So anyway, that's my bit on co-governance.
Alistair?
You go first, Stefan, because you obviously want to reply to that.
Oh no, I don't want to reply to that. I don't have any issue with what Lee just said. I was just going to ask Dougal a question whether, given the paucity of information and the impact that that's having on people's understanding of what this bill represents, and also the proximity of the local government election. Has there been talk amongst councils that one of the solutions would be to ask for more time in order to gather information, including from our community, on the content of the bill?
I think some councils are raising the question around, can the reforms occur by 1 July 2024? So I think that's probably more of a consistent theme. The government has already delayed the process of the bill for the last 8-week period, which compounded with the Christmas period probably set the process back 6 months. I suspect that they would be loath to slow the process down, because then it runs into central elections. But it's not an unreasonable issue to raise. How communities get a better understanding about the change and how they get confidence, it's always going to be one of those challenges of the DIA is literally building the plane as they're learning to fly it. It's all happening kind of real time in terms of transition from what we can see. So it's something you might want to consider. I suspect you won't get a lot of traction though.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to follow on from what Lee said. And I think, Lee, you've hit the nail on the head. I think co-governance is a fundamental issue in this issue. I'm certainly not averse to iwi having a view on water. And the reason I asked that question right at the start, Dougal, was, has this got anything to do with the use of raw material, which this bill doesn't. This is about assets. And it comes down to for me, it's fundamental that iwi's involvement in water and their outcome of water is not about the provision of services. It is about the outcomes they want to achieve. And so this representation thing in this is in the wrong place. If iwi need representation on quality of water, it should be in the water services, the regulators. That's where they will get outcome. This is about the provision of services and the ownership of assets that have been paid for by ratepayers, and there is no place in that for co-governance as far as I can tell. And I think that is the general consensus of the feeling that I've had from discussions with lots of people. But the solution to me is that iwi involvement should be in the regulation, which if from what I've been listening to, the way that people have talked about iwi wanting outcomes of water, cleaner water, better use of water and so on, the place to do that is actually setting the regulations about what comes out the end of the pipes, not actually who puts the pipes in the ground, because it's too late at that stage. And that's, to me, that's the solution for the iwi involvement in water, is at the regulatory environment, not in the delivery environment.
So the suggestion around greater iwi involvement in the regulatory environment could be a really good point to make. I would just note, of course, it's because it's a 3 waters, not 2 reforms model. It does deal with discharges a lot to lakes, rivers, streams, the coast, even the quality of wastewater and discharges.
We know there's going to be regulation on that as well. So that's where you get real outcome. You don't get real outcome about who digs up a pipe and who puts a pipe in the ground. That doesn't give outcomes. That's just contractors putting pipes in the ground and providing that people be able to turn their tap on and flush their toilet.
Any other kind of thoughts or issues to feed into Amanda's drafting?
Sorry, I had one other. I might as well keep going on it because, and it's the boundary one, and it is another cause of concern that comes up regularly. Is say, why do we have a little entity in the South Island, in Entity C? It makes no sense unless you look at it from an iwi perspective, and that is a very issue that the South Island iwi is involved in all areas except for the one area that is now in Entity C. And so it just, if you're going to have it from numbers perspective or any sort of business model, Entity C should be the lower North Island of the East Coast, not the South Island.
Yeah. You're right that it is largely based on numbers. So you'll recall some of that information which came out last year from DIA about how they came up with a 4-entity model. Agree or disagree with it. It had a range of factors. One of the primary ones was numbers of connections and consumers within an area, and the ballpark of a kind of based on their modelling of getting the best efficiency gain was having around about 1 million people. So that's where the intent of having Entity A with Auckland kind of basically forced to have Northland in it, and then largely splitting the rest of the North Island into 2, but also including the top of the South into Entity C. So you have around about 1 million people with a range of other factors as well.
Of course, it's not the top of the South. It's only the part that's not governed by Ngātahu.
That's right. Well, that's where they've
very
drawn the boundary.
Very similar to electoral boundaries. There's no rhyme or reason for it. It's a numbers game.
Any other questions or issues in terms of things you wanted to cover this evening?
One quick point, just on the impact of the 3 waters at election coming through. It's obviously going to be used as an election campaign issue going through. It'll be quite interesting to see if the whole thing is left open for that September, October issue, because the new people standing for council are going to be obviously looking at 3 waters. It'd be very interesting to see what comes out of the discussion.
Yeah, look, it will be, and that issue will come up next year as well. Local government's been asking for reforms of water for 30 years. We've got some momentum built up, so if people are going to use it as election platform, let's hope they've got some solutions to how to make the reform model work better. Because I think just about everyone is on the same page that we need some form of reform. We're not on the same page about what the reform model looks like. So yeah, undoubtedly, Garrick, it'll come up as an election issue this year and next year as well. Yep.
Oops.
Go ahead, Lee.
Hi there. Hey, this is just a quick thought for Amanda. I have some issues around the lack of transparency about the billing and who would do that should the new entity go ahead. And I just think if possibly, depending on what the other councillors think, I think there should be much greater clarity on when there's the stop-off point from local government doing the billing. Because if they want to take it over, let them do it. Don't start to fudge the waters with hazy timeframes. And the only other thing that I do have a small problem, which may not be of a great problem for SWDC, but I am concerned about the aspect of no redundancy. Because the reality is, as we all know, we've had different jobs, that if you get offered a job and, I don't know, the conditions aren't right or the salary's not right, and it's either take it or leave it, no redundancy. I just don't think that's fair under I don't know what the legislation is around employment or specific legislation, but it just seems to me unfair. This could mean that people have to relocate to Wellington or other parts of the region or whatever. So I disagree with that. It's a smaller point that nobody seems to have picked up on, but I just don't think it's fair. Those are two rather minor points, but
Yeah, it's a good point on staff, and it's a really important part of the transition process that staff are engaged and retained through the process. The provisions basically say you'd have to be offered something on same or similar terms and conditions. So you'd assume that goes as far as location being same or similar, contract, wages, etc., being same or similar. We are expecting some more detail around those transition provisions in the next couple of weeks. So we'll be scrutinising those in a lot of detail. So the no redundancy provision only kicks in if you kind of basically get offered the same or similar position and you still say, no, I don't really want to take on. But some of the councils we've talked to, they know that people will change jobs between now and then. Some people will repurpose their job. Some people will think, well, there's another opportunity for me. So there will probably be quite a lot of staff change that would need to manage carefully over the next couple of years.
it's one of those things, the devil's in the detail, Dougal.
It is, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. I don't entirely trust the whole process, so that's just a detail I also don't really trust. But anyway,
Hey, sorry guys, I'm going to have to leave. I can only hear every second word. You're cutting in and out.
All right. Hey, thank you, Jeppy. That's probably quite a good time. I think we're running out of questions, but Amanda, Stefan, do you want to run through your process and timing from here?
I can probably do it. So we'll bring a draft submission to council meeting on the 14th based on the input that you've given me this evening. And if anyone wants to give me feedback or input or has particular things they'd like to say in any detail, I'd be happy to receive those by email or phone, or if you want to come and chat. I've got some time set aside on Wednesday morning to really thoroughly do some writing. So it would be a paper put on as to be tabled at the meeting.
When is the submissions closed? When do the submissions close?
22nd.
So assuming, let's play devil's advocate and say that the paper needs to go back for redrafting again, we're going to have time to still get it through?
So I think we probably need to agree on a process for that redrafting and approval outside of a council meeting.
Okay.
Otherwise we won't make that deadline.
Yeah. Okay.
Good work, Amanda.
Yeah, great. Like I said, Amanda, I'm happy to help if you need some help. So.
Cool. Yes, Alistair, we'll come to you.
Cool.
Can I ask a question? Sorry. From the councillors, has there been a lot of feedback about the ownership of only one share compared to larger councils? Is that something that we'll need to address? And Dougal, in the bill, does it talk much about the rights of those shares, or is that going to be in the Constitution?
The shares are really a symbolic gesture to prove that the water services entities are held in public ownership. So they don't really confer a lot of rights. They are really a mechanism to help prevent privatisation of the water services entities in the future. However, as I say, through the Constitution, it could be that members decide that, if you've got three shares, you get 3 votes in terms of the representative model. But the representative model of the RRG might also say, within Entity C, we've got to have a rep from the Hawke's Bay, Tairāwhiti area, we've got to have a rep from Wellington, or it might say, we've got to have a couple of reps from the metros and a couple of reps from the rural area. It's up to the Constitution. So yeah, it doesn't really confer a lot of rights. It's really just another layer of protection against privatisation.
Can I just add to that? I think Lee hit the nail on the head that given that this is not going to go through Parliament with overwhelmingly majority, a big majority in the House, it's going to get through left versus right. So it's not, no Parliament can bind a future Parliament. And so largely this is smoke and mirrors. It actually has no standing whatsoever should the next Parliament decide to say, well, we're going to overturn this. So it doesn't stop anything, ultimately. It is purely and simply symbolic.
Pam?
Dougal, do you think that we as a council get an input into that constitution, or do you think that that is going to be made up by the incoming board?
Well, yeah, look, it's a really good question. The Constitution to me is the process of developing it is a critical way of building trust and input from the shareholders. So, I think it's one of the areas where we need to be very clear that we want to have input into it. I can see why DIA want to come up with maybe a basis for the Constitution so that there's similarity in most of the hard work's done. But I think it's really important for councils to have the opportunity to have a say into it.
Yeah, I agree totally with that. And I also at one stage there was mooted that you would have the board, and then you would have your representatives on that board, be it from a council or be it from an iwi. And then sitting underneath that, there was the idea that the councils with their votes would be doing some of that, what do you call, groundwork, or have meetings that they could put input into what was happening. But I don't hear a lot about that intermediate layer at the moment. It seems to be talking about what we'll take, what we'll do with it, but nothing about that conversation that they're going to get from the ground upwards to get the feel of what's happening in the each community.
Yes, I agree. So I've just put up this slide again. So on the right-hand side there, you'll see the regional advisory panels.
Oh, yeah.
So this is kind of similar to what we were talking about. I think because the idea came out of the Wellington regional councils, and what we basically said was, we don't want investment trade-off decisions to be, made between Nelson and Napier and Martinborough. That's just silly, and we want the ability to represent and have local voice coming from our local community. So we need some kind of sub-regional representation group, and so in the bill they've called them regional advisory panels. Again, exactly what they do and how they're formed is a matter for the Constitution. So across Entity C, do the councils think this is a good idea? And if so, do we have one of these for Rafferty Hawke's Bay area, and another for Central Hawke's Bay, maybe down through Tararua, Wairarapa, and then another one for the Wellington metro area? What's the best way of kind of getting community voice in there? And then that kind of links as well to the direction of travel for the RMA reforms and spatial planning. We're potentially going to have spatial plans and spatial planning committees. If you could align the areas that those cover with the areas of these regional advisory panels, that helps to address some of the issues around land use planning integration as well.
Good thought. But I think that needs to be in our submission, something about that in our submission. Yeah.
Could I just ask, following on from that with the regional representative, there's a lot in the bill about the how the councils or the who can be on it from the council side. There doesn't seem to be a lot in there about how the iwi side will select their equal representation, and of course they have a significantly bigger number of people to talk to. So surely one of the faults that I could see, assuming this bill goes through as it is, there is no governor, there is no legal structure for iwi to call their representatives, or timeframes or anything else. So what happens if amongst the God knows how many iwi and hapu in Area C cannot agree on the 6 people? What happens then?
I'm not sure what happens then. Actually, I could look at the bill and double check that, but I'm not sure the bill covers it off, and maybe that's a matter for the Constitution. It's a good point. But you're right. It very much focuses on the selection process of council representatives, but it doesn't even really spell out how councils would work together to select those representatives. And DIA has been very clear in terms of iwi Māori representation. That would be a matter for iwi Māori to work together to decide how that was done, reflecting local kaupapa. Look, as you say, it's going to be challenging. There's a large number of big iwi, a large number of hapu, a large number of marae-based Māori organisations, and various levels of resource, capability, capacity to be involved in the process. So, I think it will be it'll take time to work through that process.
Is that something that we need to put into our submission and say, we're not comfortable with something that actually is so loose, when there is this broader guidance for elected members from council about who can sit on it, be it CEOs or an elected member or so on, but must have a background in water or whatever the terminology was. But there doesn't seem to be that side on the other side of the representational group. And of course the bill says unless they're both equally represented, nothing can really happen. It ends up in a God knows where. So do we need to say that's a weakness that we're seeing as well?
It could be Maddie, you want to raise this?
I agree with you, Alistair. I think it needs to be a skill-based set of, quite specifically laid out a minimum amount of skills to actually be on that co-governance board. It's sort of like the big elephant in the room. A lot of people are too scared to say these things. It's been driven politically by the Labour Party. They've got a specific agenda, and whatever you personally think about that, I don't think we can ignore it or allow us not to ask some tough questions about it. Because it seems to me that we're elected on our skills or our knowledge or whatever. So in something so important as this, there should be a very, very critical interview process, maybe shortlisted by iwi, which would be fine, but there has to be a minimum skill set to actually be on this co-governance.
Look, I can't speak to that, but I guess what is important to recognise is that iwi Māori have had ways of deciding on representation and membership of marae committee, iwi organisations. They do have a lot of skill and experience, which I think it's important to recognise. They're not coming to this afresh. They've been doing this for a long, long time. It's a different model.
I agree with you, but this is potentially one of the largest entities that we will have in New Zealand. And if you just think about the capital value, worth billions. So we're not talking about a small entity here. It doesn't even compare to the DHBs, for example. It's massive. So, personally, I'd like to see some sort of statement around that in our submission.
Yeah.
Sorry, I hadn't lowered my hand from before, but I was going to ask: is the time frame that, like, we've got a very tight time frame to put in our submissions and things? Are the submissions that are going to come from iwi, because obviously they will have some concerns about how this is happening and rolling out and things, are they do their submissions have to be in at the same time, or is there a difference because they're a co-government and they're not losing any of their assets, so to speak? I just don't understand that side of it.
No, so it's the same time period for everyone, as I understand it. So anyone who wants to make a formal submission to the select committee needs to get that in by next Friday, midnight next Friday, I think it is. It's not to say there isn't ongoing engagement. Like DIA is engaging at various levels with iwi, DIA are engaging at various levels with councils. So there are various fora for council officers to input into the reforms process through technical working groups, through governance working groups. So there are multiple channels which will continue throughout the reforms process. The select committee process is the formal process of calling for public submissions before the select committee to formally input into the legislation. And we've even gone to, we know some of the people that we're working with at DIA, we've gone to and said, look, one of our technical team has raised a bunch of very technical comments. Do you want those informally to feed in to help improve the bill? And said, no, it really does need to form part of a submission. We run a pretty straight bat process here. Find a way of including it in your submission process. So it's all very transparent.
Just on that note, Dougal, how have they, or is there any level of detail about conflict of interest in terms of people who are appointed on the co-governance board? Conflict of interest in terms of family members or existing commercial operations or businesses, etc.
Yeah, sorry, I was looking around for my copy of the bill there. I can't tell you offhand, but the expectation is if you're appointed as part of a representative group, you're there to represent the entity level, not to represent specifically your council. So, for example, if you yourself were on the regional representative group for the entity, you'd be there to represent the entity, not specifically there for South Wairarapa. But I think, again, it's a matter for the Constitution to be very clear on how it manages some of those detailed issues like conflicts of interest, being clear and transparent around meetings and procedures and that kind of process.
Thanks, Dougal.
Great. Hey, well, Amanda, you've got everything you need by the sounds of things? Yep, cool. Stefan, anything you wanted to say to wrap up?
Well, just that it's been a productive conversation, and thank you all for spending your evening on this. I did want to particularly say thank you to you, Dougal. You've made your time available to us tonight, but you're also always available to me and to my colleagues on the phone at any time on any issue, and you're fantastic to work with, and we really appreciate that. So just with that, we might let everyone go and get some dinner or a cup of tea.
It's dinner. Thank you so much, Dougal.
All right, thank you
so much, Stefan.
Thanks all.
Yeah.
Good to be
Thanks,
part of the
guys. Thank
conversation.
you. And
Cheers.
thank you
Thank
to
you,
all
team.
the staff. See you guys.
Thanks very much to everyone.